don't know how, but by hook or by crook, Gloria and I have started having a bajillion mason jars in our cups and glasses area of our cabinet. So what's happening is almost like a virus. The mason jars are spreading. They are growing. So now we have, I think, 60 to 70% mason jars and 30% actual cups in our cabinet. So now everywhere I go to my house, I'm like filling up a mason jar for water, and it looks like I've got a still in the backcountry of Tennessee, and I'm making moonshine. And I like you go to grab a glass of water out of a mason jar, and you feel like, oh yeah, we got a good old, we got some great old moonshine. I hear the police coming. Let's get out of here.
Yeah, reminds me of a girl I used to date in Bad Axe. She used to make her own moonshine, but I loved her still.
I don't even know what that joke means. What does that joke mean? I'm trying to parse that out quickly so that I don't look like an idiot, but I don't know what that joke means.
You're hitting on an absolute thing that I hate, though. It's a pet peeve. I can't stand the feeling of my lips drinking off of a mason jar because of those grooves that are in it. And we've got the same thing. Carolyn uses them all the time for canning and storing food and stuff. And because it's better than using a Ziploc bag, and we're trying to be good for the environment, and glass is very recyclable, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But they keep ending up in the drinking glasses. I keep putting them over on the other side because I can't stand drinking out of a mason jar. It makes my lips feel awful. I've got very sensitive lips.
I'm delighted by this. Like, Doc, I gotta tell you, I just got sensitive lips.
I can't stand the feet because you got those ridges over. How can you drink out of a mason jar with the ridges?
So you're a man that likes smooth, not ribbed. Okay, so that we're learning a lot about Brad. Okay, so
as if you didn't know.
Here's the thing is that a mason jar is indestructible. I have dropped like 4 of these things full of, I don't know, 2.5 pounds of water, and they freaking just bounce right 4 feet off the air and right back into your hand. Like, I'm ready to go. Let's do this again. They don't break.
Oh my goodness. Well, listen, they are good for a number of things. They're wonderful, just not for drinking.
I feel like, though, I don't know who figured out a mason jar that if you just quadruple the amount of glass in there, and for your peaches, and when you're going to put up peaches, or you're going to can for the winter, that if you just make the glass 19 inches thick, the damn thing will not break. Like, my iPhone has some things to learn from this mason jar.
Yeah, it's pretty darn useful.
But you're a man of high taste, though. You like thinness on your lips. You like a soft, delicate, baby soft glass.
Smooth, just like my scotch. Smooth. It's got to be nice and easy.
I feel when you've got a mason jar in your hand, though, there's nothing that feels smooth about it. You feel like you've got 3 teeth left, and you graduated from the 3rd grade, and you left to work in the I don't know what local industry you would work in.
One of these guys that gets so excited when he graduates high school, he cuts himself shaving. That kind of guy.
I feel like, though, if you have a mason jar, if you use a mason jar eventually long enough, you eventually have to get truck nuts for your truck. That's the side.
Yeah, I saw one of those on a Prius once, and I'm like, what are you trying to prove?
You saw truck nuts on a Prius?
Truck nuts on a Prius.
That's amazing.
Talk about irony or overcompensating.
Yeah, I feel like that's a what do you call it? A hipster trying to make fun of the concept, but just a swing and a miss. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics
and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive, and Sheldon, currently hoisting a mason jar with great joy. I'm also the co-director of Stripped.
And this week's hour of comics advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. And let's also mention, for folks that are excited about it, ComicLab, as you know, one of our favorite things we ever did was Brad came up with the phrase ComicLab cash grab. Well, we have something even better as far as internal rhyme scheme. ComicLab Live Gab is the new live stream show that we do now every week. It'll be on Tuesday mornings 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And for $10 members of the Patreon community, you can watch the show live, which includes the gaffes, the pre-show delightful banter, the mid-show banter, and maybe some questions along the way that you can ask. And so for everyone, the date is coming up on June. June is when we're officially launching. We're going to be doing ComicLab Live Gab every week.
Fantastic. And Dave, we've got a question over there to start the show off. What are we going to kick the show off with?
Well, Alexander Loken, again, our buddy from Norway, was exciting. Alexander writes in, Dear Dave and Brad, as creative people, I'm sure you guys come up with new and interesting concepts and ideas all the time. Not necessarily comics, but documentary movies, children's books, and so on. How do you prevent yourselves from being distracted by these new, shiny ideas? And how do you know what side projects to develop further and which ones to abandon? Personally, I jump from idea to idea, sometimes weekly or even daily, and it can be hard to get anything done. Thanks, and thanks for making my favorite podcast, Alexander from Norway. I appreciate that Alexander always highlights that he's from Norway now. This is delightful.
Yeah.
I'm going to start saying Dave Kellett from Los Angeles in any of my interactions, even around Los Angeles.
That's how my dad always used to answer the phone. Still answers the phone a lot of times. Yeah, this is John Geiger from Bad Axe.
No, he doesn't.
Like, how many John Geigers could there possibly be? But he's John Geiger from Bad Axe.
I got to tell you, though, the name Bad Axe, if I came from a town called Bad Axe, I would absolutely 100% be using that in any interaction.
You just slide it right into any question, any conversation.
Absolutely, especially in my dating years. I'm Dave Kellett from Bad Axe. How are you? Hello, hi.
I got news for you. It doesn't work so well.
Because everybody from Michigan equates Bad Axe with a single cow out in a field. All right, so let me ask you, Brad. You and I both have pitched one another, even in just the last 6 months, on varying ideas of shiny new objects to Alexander's question of what we could do, side projects we could do individually, as groups, in comics, parallel to comics, outside of comics. But how do you, Brad Geiger, keep from being distracted and focusing in on, I don't want to say the most important, because some of these ideas can develop and do important things in your life, but focus on the thing that is keeping you going, keeping your career moving right now?
Wow, it's literally one of the toughest questions in creativity is how to not get sidetracked. And over the years, Dave, we've both seen people get sidetracked to the detriment of their careers. I mean, there was one person I'm thinking of specifically that was a publisher and got completely obsessed with this whole political part of their life, and the publishing kind of suffered for it, and they're not publishing comics anymore or publishing anything, quite frankly. This was a print publisher. And we've seen this so many times in so many different places that getting distracted by shiny objects can actually be very dangerous. And frankly, Dave, you took a huge risk doing Stripped. That could have completely derailed you as a creator, right? It was
absolutely
a risk that I know that you had to have been cognizant of.
Yeah. And for big chunks of that project, you remember, Brad, so that movie took 4 years to make. And I would say the first 3 years of it, the project was manageable as a side project. Because Fred and I could plan a trip to Canada to interview Lynn Johnston, plan a trip to Indiana to go interview Jim Davis. We would do here and there, like, hey, Gloria, I'm going to be out of town for 3 days or 2 days or whatever it was. Manageable. You come back, you work on the plane, you're cartooning. By the way, have you ever cartooned on a plane in that little table that they give you?
No, I can't.
When I made the movie, I had to do a lot of cartooning on that little table. And you always get the business person next to you going, drawing your little pictures, huh? And you're like, fuck you, I will murder you in your seat. Drawing my little pictures. I don't know what it is, but whenever somebody uses a diminutive with me about little pictures or little drawings, it's one of the few times that I boil into a rage. I'm like, little pictures, I will little picture you.
Yeah, it's there's a problem with you, and it's because you've got this little thing that we like to call self-respect. And when somebody's being a jerk to you, you have too much self-respect to take it.
So anyways, yes, the Stripped could have been very distracting, because especially in that last year in editing phase, when we were doing a lot of After Effects, a lot of post-production, a lot of editing, a lot of music and sound effect mastering. Boy, did that burn up time to the point that I had to step away from Drive. And so to your point, it absolutely could have pulled me off course.
Yeah.
Where I stopped doing Drive or I stopped doing cartooning because I had a friend of mine who is a filmmaker. When that film came out, was like, all right, what's your next film? And had I taken one step in the wrong direction, I could have kept making films. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because he's like, I have some ideas for you for your next film. And I was like, I could go that route. I don't want to go that route. You know what I mean?
Right.
So for me, it's I always like that idea of the Socratic ideal, which is in this particular moment, what is the best choice you can make in this moment? That's always been a helpful formulation. It's one of the few things from philosophy classes that I remembered, which is that idea of a Socratic ideal in this moment. And for me, in any given moment, usually my Socratic ideal is like, I enjoy Drive. I enjoy telling that story. People are enjoying it. It's making me a great living. Keep doing that, you dummy. Don't get distracted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, as long as that individual choice, day to day, week to week, month to month, is keep doing it, I'm on firm ground. The problem is, like you, I have a flood of ideas all the time for projects and little side things. And of course, I want to do the new because sometimes the current feels rote or feels done or overdone or overwrought, and you want to try out the new thing. But the thing I've learned for me is to give myself the gift every year, year and a half, 2 years to work in those smaller side projects into the ecosphere of what I'm doing right now. So you saw me do that Anatomy of Animals book, totally different from Sheldon and Drive.
Yeah.
But I just worked it into Sheldon and I was like, F it, this is what you're getting. And then that worked out well enough where I did Anatomy of Authors. I'm eventually going to do it with that children's book that we've talked about, Your Life is a Line. And I've seen you do it too, where you just work things into your Patreon, into Evil Inc. Talk about that for a minute because you've done it very well, I think.
Well, so for me, it's about knowing who I am.
Ooh, okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, what that means is like I am a cartoonist.
Okay.
Period. That's what I am. I'm also an author, but that comes after being a cartoonist, right? I'm also a podcaster, but that comes after being a cartoonist. And I also like to do any number of things, but the number one thing I am is a cartoonist. That means I need to put out a certain amount of work as a cartoonist every week. And that's the banner thing. I do a podcast and that fits into that.
Yes.
But and I do a number of other things. In fact, I just started doing over the last week an awful lot of what I would call like, not really motivational, but kind of like creative pep talks. And I've been putting them up on Instagram and Twitter. And as a matter of fact, speaking of Patreon backers, Chris Hallbeck got in touch with me, and Hallbeck says, I see what you're doing on Instagram. You've got to do it on TikTok. Trust me, you got to do it. And I wrote him back. I said, there's probably I could count on my left hand the number of people that could get me to drop what I'm doing, take their advice, and not question it. And the next thing I texted him was the link to the TikTok I just put up. I'd had to go. I'd gotten rid of TikTok. I'd gotten disgusted with it. I had to go back and rebuild my account, and I posted it. So far, the engagement has been right on the mark with what he's saying. But all of which to say, now I'm doing motivational TikToks. And it's a freaking shiny object because there's all these new problems to solve. And I love solving problems. These, how am I going to get the captions in? How am I going to do this? How am I going to get some special effects? How am I going to keep it to 1 minute? As you can tell, if you listen to the podcast, me editing myself to 1 minute is not intuitive. I like to talk. I like to be lugubrious. I get carried away. But I'm really, really getting obsessed with doing these primarily on TikTok, these kind of like creative pep talks where I say, let's talk about what an idea is. Let's talk about what happens when you realize you got the same idea as somebody else. What does that mean? I've got a great one coming up that I don't even want to spoil. But what happens is I come into the studio, turn on the lights, and for the first hour, sometimes 2 hours, stand here in front of my ring light and perform. And then I edit the video, and then pretty soon I'm going to have to make a decision on that, whether it's a shiny object or whether it's a detriment.
So having watched those TikTok videos, and they are delight, my one bit of editing advice is just, I think personally for me, I don't think you need the Speedo. I think just go wear full clothes as you do it. Like, I don't think people come, the thirst traps are nice, but I think people want the cartooning advice from you. You know what I mean?
The thing is, did you notice how the Speedo color coordinates with my nipple clamps?
I did, and I thought, like, I don't even know, and the fact that you even got the phrase banana hammock printed on there was nice. Like, I thought that was nice, but I just don't think you need in a TikTok about cartooning advice. I don't know that you need that. Is what I'm saying. I don't think you need to sell yourself short as just an object to be glared at. You know, you have ideas, Brad, and they're worthy. You don't need to be.
I'd rather be an object. But all of which to say is this is something that we struggle with constantly. Right now, I've got a shiny object. I know I've got a shiny object, and I'm going to have to decide pretty soon, you know, how I incorporate that, you know, and whether it's worth the amount of time I'm putting in it. Just last week, we talked a little bit about TikTok, and I said, you've got to decide whether that's active engagement you're getting or passive, right? In other words, is the engagement I'm getting worth it? And that's at the end of the day, that's what the consideration is going to come down to. Is this worth it? If I decide it's not worth it, and if it hampers my ability to be a cartoonist, my number one thing, then it's got to go.
Yeah, I want to swing back around on what I think is the best construction so far to answer this question, which is your idea of a hierarchy, that you are a cartoonist first, and then first choose the things that feed directly into that. Once you have that established, once you have the time managed for that and the project managed for that, then you can do secondary things that maybe feed into those, like in the sense that the podcast that you do, the books that you write, the website that you maintain for webcomics.com all feed into the first goal, which is you are a cartoonist. You make Evil Ink, and you make Evil Ink After Dark, and you do all the smaller comics titles that you do. That's the first one, right? And then the second tier is all the supportive things that still feed into being a cartoonist. And then the tertiary ones, like you said, are the things like the shiny TikToks, you know? And so I think that's a really good construction, because I also would say that I've never framed it that way in my mind, but a version of that is I'm a person that creates Sheldon and Drive. Those are the primary things that I do. And then secondary to that is, what can I do that's fun and around that? Well, I've gotten pretty good about talking about comics and thinking about comics and studying comics. I'm going to make a podcast with my buddy Brad, and we'll talk about that. That's secondary, but it feeds into the first one. You know what I mean? Like, so, and then there are things that are shiny, like process things. So, for example, every 2 or 3 years, I get like a bug up my butt to be like, I got to get better at watercolor, right?
Yeah.
Well, I could go out and do pastorals, but what I do is I create comic watercolors that I throw up on eBay. Okay, great. It fed my watercolor habit or desire. And in the meantime, I made a couple $100 putting up a piece on eBay. You know what I mean? Like, there's ways to have it all flow into that stream, that tributary is feeding down at the main river, like Brad said, where that's the main project. But it's hard. I will admit, like Brad, this is one of the hardest things to do in creativity, is to know how to stay on the path when the new idea seems as good, if not way better than the current thing. And then it's a version of grass is always greener, because you haven't started with the problems on that project yet. It's only the potential. It's only the blue sky. And that's why it's so distracting.
Absolutely. Now take everything that we just got done saying and apply it to something that happened a couple episodes back, where somebody said, hey, whatever happened to you guys doing comics to submit for the New Yorker?
Yeah.
Right.
That's a perfect example, actually. Yeah.
It would seem as if that would feed right into my number one hierarchy thing, being a cartoonist.
Right.
But it's not as simple as that, because number one, submitting comics to the New Yorker would not bring me as much joy as doing those other things. And that's another thing we got to talk about. What is bringing you joy? That's a big one. And also, I'm not going to go down and hammer that away again, but it was just something that had a lot of effort with a little return on investment that just wasn't worth it. So we got rid of it. But I bring that up just to say that sometimes it's not just as easy as saying, well, I'm a cartoonist, so this is what I do. Sometimes you've got to take other things into account too and say, come back to that ROI discussion. Is there a good return on investment in this?
Yeah, ROI is a great construction. Can I posit this, Brad, just as a final thought, because I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Is it easier for us as established cartoonists, established in their career, we've got the projects going, they're humming along, the audience has been built, the income has not started, it is coming in consistently. Is it easier for us at this point to say no thank you to the shiny object and push it to the side than it is for someone in year 1 and 2, where the weights are more evenly distributed? Like, you could very easily stop a project that you've been doing for a year that doesn't have an audience yet, doesn't have the income yet, and here comes along the shiny object. I will say that I think this is a problem that is actually harder when you are starting than it is when you're on year 20 of cartooning.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely 100% right. It's much, much harder at that point. And part of me wants to say, and check me if this is wrong, because I haven't thought this all the way through. However, if you don't have that hierarchy, you're never going to get to the point where you can have that solid career that you can rely on. In other words, if you're constantly getting distracted in those early days, you're never gonna get to the point where you can call this a career. At some point, in other words, you can make a lot of those choices, but at some point you've got to decide, I'm going to do this thing, because doing it takes commitment. It's going to take a lot of years to build. I mean, take a look at us. We've been at this 20 years. It wasn't 20 years of established a career. It was 20 years building towards that established career.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate to say that that although it is tougher, you've got to make a decision at some point and then go put your full energy behind that?
Well, yeah, I think that there's, that old phrase of you're a master of none, the idea that you can jump project to project and shiny object to shiny object, but then in so doing, you don't truly master or advance yourself in one of them, Right. I think in the show many moons ago, I referenced a conversation that for whatever reason has been really critical in my own career. I was driving with David Malky. I think I told you about this story. We were driving to downtown Los Angeles to pick up T-shirts of all things that we were getting printed in the fabric or the fashion district of Los Angeles. And we were getting to know each other, and he and I were talking about, I said, I'm going to be a cartoonist first. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do cartooning. And then from cartooning, eventually 10 years, 15 years out, I will branch out into film. I'll branch out into TV and storytelling and all that sort of stuff. And David, his response was, no, I want to do 5 things at once and get better and better. And they'll all feed in on each other. Right. Yeah. And the side note to this, or the response to all this 20 years on, is that we both worked out. Like, it both worked out. Right. I'm a cartoonist. Dave's a cartoonist. I do many projects. Dave does many projects. So I guess it also has on some level the ability of how much can you process at once in your brain. I can only do 2 or 3 projects at once, and after that, my coordination and my scheduling gets really bad. David maybe is just better at doing all those things at once, and so his rising tide lifted 5 boats, whereas mine only lifted 2.
Absolutely. And as I'm going over, what I just got done saying, I do believe that at some point you've got to kind of make a commitment. However, there's another part, and this is advice that I've given on this show an awful lot, and that is, at some point, if your thing isn't working out, you've got to change, right? Like, how many times have we seen people working on independent comics for year after year after year, and it's just not working for them? And I always say, don't stay with a mistake just because it took you a long time to make it. Yeah. And you want these people to take what they learned doing comics and apply it to something else that might be more successful for them. So in as much as I stand behind what I say about at some point you got to commit, as you're going along, you also have to take a really hard look at where you are, where you're going, and how it's working out, and keep the option open to pivot to something else that also brings you joy or might bring you more joy. And we've seen that too, Dave. How many people are preventing themselves from doing something that might bring them more joy? But by God, they started doing a comic and they haven't done this yet. And they don't want to be a failure if they stop doing this and do something else.
Right. And that's an interesting, it's almost a case by case basis. Like, it's hard to say to someone both at like the 3-year point of a project, no, you don't know, you just need to work harder and keep going at it. Yeah. And then to the other person, also at the exact same 3-year point, no, this is sunk cost fallacy. You should have given up on this a year ago. This project is not working. It's hard from unless you really get in on the nitty gritty of the details, it's hard to broadly speak that like, nope, at the 3-year point, you got to quit, or at the 3-year point, you got to buckle down, because sometimes it's dependent on personality and what got you to that point. Don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a hard one. And by the way, I mean, part of me wants to give a snappy little platitude or something that is easily digestible and you can take it to the bank. The problem is that this topic we're talking about, there's, like you just got done saying, there's no broad application. There's a little, we've said about 5 different things. They're each fucking true.
Yeah. Because let's take, for example, Brad, at the point that I started Stripped, I was really starting to build up an audience in Drive. It was starting to make good money. And so with every good logical reason in the world, had I come to you and said, Brad, I think I kind of want to make a documentary on comic strips and the state of comic strips right now, you would have been like, yeah, but what about Drive? You've built up a second comic strip that it's actually making as much, if not more, than Sheldon. What are you doing? Yeah. You're going to have to put a pause on that to do the documentary? No. What do you, like, have a little bit of focus? And because, you start looking like a meerkat on cocaine. You're like, oh, this next project, I'm going to do this next one. And so a meerkat on cocaine, how did my mind come up with that?
That's beautiful. That's a great mental image, too.
Anyway, you, with all good reason, would have logically said, no, look at, you did the thing. You got this project going. Yeah. But I had to follow my joy in that moment. I was feeling like I really wanted to make a comment while certain cartoonists were still alive about the arc. I wanted to capture their interviews about where they were and what they saw, the denouement of newspapers and transitioning in the web. And I had a window, there was like a window of like 3 or 4 years before, God rest his soul, Mort Walker and Mel Lazarus started to pass. And so I wanted to get those interviews because, we'd already lost Sparky. And I was like, I wish I had gotten that interview before he died, And so anyway, long story short, I had a moment. I went to the shiny new object. It worked out fine in the long run. Yeah. But with all good logical reason, had you caught me at the right time, you could have said, no, this is not a good idea to do this project right now.
Maybe that's the platitude that we end on with this topic. And that is this. It all worked out in the long run, right? In other words, what do we keep saying? It's not a marathon, it's a sprint. So let's say you've stayed with this project for a little bit longer than you should have, right? It's okay. Keep going. You'll do okay in the long run, right? Let's say that you did get distracted by something and you feel you're listening to the show and you're like, I got distracted and now I feel dumb. No, it just means that was part of your path. Your path took a detour. You're not done yet. You're still going. Keep going. Yeah. Maybe that's where we land on this is that, sometimes shiny objects happen. Just keep going.
Yeah. I mean, A, that is a platitude, but B, it's also super true. It does shake out all right now. I mean, here's one bit of comfort I get in terms of life, right? This is a broader 30,000 feet up in the air looking down. One of the things that I find really comforting about interviews with septuagenarians and octogenarians is, for the most part, 1 out of 100, you'll get one of them in an interview that has a tremendous regret. Oh, I wish at 25 that I would have told Susie McDurkins that I loved her and then I could have married her and whatever, you know what I mean? You'll get 1 out of 100 say that. But the other 99 always say like, you know what? It all worked out in the end. I wouldn't go back and change anything. It had to happen the way it had to happen. The good things, the bad things. And I find tremendous comfort in that from septuagenarians and octogenarians that, like, in the end, your career will work out all right. It's just, there will be dips, there will be valleys, there will be shiny objects, like you said, Brad. And I think, I do think that's perhaps the best button you can put on that in a very complicated and emotionally charged question.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
Okay, Brad, well, our next question from patreon.com/comiclab comes in from Shani, and Shani writes, if you're doing a long-form comic with the intention to host it on Patreon, is the vertical scroll form... I almost said scroll, like the scroll invasion. The vertical scroll format, which can become Captain America, it becomes the Thing. The scrolls are really amazing what they can become.
And often has, yes.
If you're doing a long-form comic with the intention to host it on Patreon, is the vertical scroll format still important? Could a vertical scroll... Now I keep wanting to say scroll. Could the vertical scroll format become a Patreon tier exclusive? I know the idea is to avoid readers having to pinch and zoom, but there are a lot of successful webcomics that aren't in the vertical scroll format. So Patreon backers seem to tolerate book page layouts. It's a personal goal of mine to start the webcomic through Patreon and eventually offer a printed book to higher pledged backers. So it would be really easy to format the pages to the eventual book if they're not in the vertical scroll. What are your thoughts on this? Cheers, y'all. Thanks for being so informative and hilarious. Listening to y'all is a joy in the workday. Best, Shani. Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Shani. I really appreciate that. That's very nice of you.
So much here to unpack. There's a lot to talk about here. First off, we've got to address cargo cult syndrome, and that is taking a look at somebody doing something successfully and without taking the time to understand the why behind the what, making a whole bunch of assumptions about their success. So let's talk about this. There are a lot of successful webcomics that aren't in the vertical scroll format, so Patreon backers seem to tolerate book page layouts. You have absolutely no basis of making that assumption. They're doing something completely different. Number one, you don't even really know if they're successful or whether you're perceiving them as successful. What is success? Do they have 1 million followers on Webtoons? Unless they're able to convert that into money, they may not be as successful as you think they are.
Well, can I interject real quick? Let's just assume that Shani, I'm assuming good faith here. She's looked on their Patreon. They have 1,500 followers. Even if it's $1 a follower, that's a great month, you know? So let's just assume that Shani's saying that okay, now answer the question. Now, if you remove that idea of cargo culting.
But you can't. The question.
So you're
is
saying
not,
you're saying this is key that we need to talk about.
This is something I want to talk about. The question is not. They're not doing it, so I don't need to do it. That's not the question. The question is, do I need to do it? Doesn't matter what that other guy is doing.
I see.
What do I need to do? That's the question.
I'm sorry that okay. Yes.
All right. Now, should you be doing vertical scroll? The answer is yes, and I'll tell you why. Number one, you should be breaking those down into individual panels for a number of reasons. Number one, I don't post a vertical scroll on Patreon, but I'll paste a full page, and then I'll paste in that multi-image post, I'll post each of the individual panels because a lot of my backers read their Patreon on the Patreon app on their digital devices, like their iPhones and their Androids. And it's a lot easier to read it if they can scroll through the panels one after another after another. It's about communicating clearly with my Patreon backers, giving them that comic in the way that they can read it most easily. I don't give two shits if somebody else is doing something different. That's what my Patreon backers are getting.
Can I ask you a technical question? Because I don't do this, and I would actually like to learn from you. So you present the full page, and then you have anything underneath it visually that says swipe to read individual panels, or do you just assume that they're going to?
They can see on the app that there's more panels.
Okay. So second question, Let's say panel 1 is slightly more horizontally oriented than panel 2. Do you put them on a consistently sized tile and keep them the same size, or do you make panel 1 1,000 pixels wide and panel 2 1,000 pixels wide, even if they are differently ratioed in terms of height to width?
They've got the same pixel width, even if they're different shapes, just to keep that pixel width organized and uniform. And there's a reason for that I'll get to in a little bit.
Okay, so third technical question. So you don't technically mind that the font goes font on panel 1, font on panel 2. That doesn't bother you.
I don't mind that it varies a little bit. It tends not to vary that much the way you're talking about it, but it will vary a little bit using this approach.
Okay. I'm not saying that Brad is anything other than smart in doing this. I don't do this, and I wanted to learn, so I took a moment, and I'm sorry about that.
It's gotten to the point where I actually get angry at the cartoonists that I follow that don't do it, because seriously, and by the way, you're not the only one. There's a bunch of them, and I'm like, because I hate pinching and zooming when I've got to read their stuff on Patreon. It's and I was like, I'm a backer. I should have this in the perfect format, and I got to pinch and zoom to read this shit, especially when it's so freaking easy to break that down into panels.
Okay, so as a cartoonist who does not do that, so I'm sorry that I'm making you angry. I have to ask you, does your and my favorite cartoonist Scott Kurtz do that for his Patreon, or just?
No.
I love the idea that Scott might casually be listening and just like this recurring bromance joke of you and Scott. Like, oh, Scott's the greatest cartoonist that ever lived.
Yeah. So here's the deal. And immediately there's going to be a whole bunch of, well, what do you do when this? And how about when this other thing? Blah, 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 blah. Here's the deal. These are all, number one, creative problems for you to solve. It's not a big deal. It's not very hard. And as long as we talked about this for a little while ago, I was talking about diagonal gutters on comic book pages and how they really stunk and they didn't really add anything. As long as you're kind of keeping your panels to being somewhat rectangular, right? If you keep to rectangular panels and if you plan things out a little bit, it's very, very easy to incorporate a vertical scroll. The biggest problem that you'll have once you eliminate, what do you call those, orthogonal, or there's another word when it's not a perfect rectangle. Anyway,
parallelogram, or?
Yeah, as long as you don't have parallelogram panels, your biggest problem is panels that are super horizontal. They span the entire width of the page. That'll be the biggest problem that you deal with. And again, that's a creative problem for you to solve. And by the way, if you read Evil Inc. After Dark, you see a lot of times when I've got things from one panel that overlap into the other panel and stuff like that. But you have to understand, I've planned that so that it can be cropped into rectangles. I've made sure that if something's reaching over into another panel, that if I crop that, anything that goes underneath that reach can be deleted. And it's not going to matter for the other panel. I've planned all that out. It's taken me an extra 5 seconds just to make sure that I can crop every panel into a rectangle. And the payoff is, number one, you put these up on a panel by panel swipe on your Patreon, and boom, you've given your Patreon readers a much easier read on their app. Number two, it's already pre-prepared for social media, where also you're probably going to want a panel by panel swipe. For example, on Instagram or on Facebook, where you can post these things in multiple panels. Boom. Number three, you're getting ready to do that Kickstarter for the book. Now you've got an ebook, and the ebook is in vertical scroll because your people are going to be reading it on their phone. They're not going to want to pinch and zoom. It's not good enough anymore just to have a PDF of your book. By the way, that's available too for people with tablets. I understand that, and I do it. But these days, when I put an ebook out, I'm putting 2 ebooks out. One of them is just the PDF of my book. The other one is taking all those panels that I've been doing on an ongoing basis. And now I've got a special ebook version of I've got a special vertical scroll version of my ebook. Boom. Now and by the way, if you want to take those panels and see if you can do some funny things with animating between the panels to make use of something like TikTok or Instagram, boom, you've already got them done. You've done a little bit of planning, and it has formed into so many ways of making your comic useful that it doesn't matter what that other guy is doing. You should be doing this because, especially if you're in audience building mode and you're not to that point yet, absolutely you should be doing this because you, along with me, we need every bit of edge that we can get. I need to be able to put my ebook out in a vertical scroll panel because I need that edge. I need to be able to put those panels up on social media so that they can be scrolled through one after another. I need every edge I could get. I don't care what that other guy is doing. This is what I need. And I'm going to argue very strongly, you should be doing it too.
And Shani, just so you know, when Brad says arguing very strongly that you should be doing it, he's looking directly at me. This is an intervention for his friend.
Yes, I'm telling you, I would listen if we were talking about this honestly. I'd be using the same language. I think you should be doing this. I want to be able to read Drive on a panel by panel swipe in my Patreon app. It's how I'm reading it.
Okay, so I have a lot of things to unpack about this. I will say, broadly speaking, big picture, Brad is probably right. I think Brad has probably got the better path than I do. I have found a path that works for Sheldon, but I think there's strength in Brad's idea that, like, listen, you got to be doing everything you can to be growing your audience. This is one thing that I'm not doing, and maybe it's to my detriment. I will say that I know Brad just said that he designs his longer. If he does have a long horizontal panel, he designs it to be spliced in half. I do not have particularly exciting page layouts, but that being said, I design the page for book format, as does Brad. But for me, I end up with long horizontal panels. I every once in a while have an experimental panel layout that's sometimes more interesting than others. But anyway, what I'm getting at is I design it for the book, not for a vertical scroll. And also, that's step number 1. Step number 2 is I very early on got burned by the Patreon app when they released their first 2 versions or whatever. And I have not used it in years. Has it gotten better? Do people use it? Do they read on the Patreon app? Because I find it to be terrible. I did a survey. Now, again, you should do a survey for your readers to find out if your readers are using the app. I did a survey for mine. And it was not as strong as I assumed it was, but it was still very, very robust, the amount of people using the app. And just in general, I know it just through watching web publishing for the past several years, I know that people are going to be using their phones more and more and more. And our readers are going to be using desktop less and less and less. Oh, sure. That's already happened. Yeah.
Into that curve. Yeah.
Yeah. That's, I agree with you. That's already happened. Well, now let's, there's still more to unpack in Shani's question. So I want to jump into one other thing where Shani says, I'm going to host it on Patreon. Yeah. And I want to say that, Shani, if you have the wherewithal, I would like to suggest that you also host it somewhere else, not just on Patreon. Brad just did a really weird pose when I said that. I'm not sure what kind of Nancy Kerrigan ice skating pose that was. What was that you just did? I said host it somewhere else, and Brad struck a pose that can only be described as weird Madonna voguing from the late 90s. I don't know what that
was. Well, I ask you this, Dave Kellett, where else am I hosting Evil Ink After Dark?
In books, but yes, I know what you mean. Yeah.
In other words, here's what I'm saying. If Shani's talking about this, and I think I did see the word exclusive there. If Shani's talking about this in terms of it being a Patreon exclusive, then I know what she's talking about in terms of hosting it on Patreon. In other words, this is the only place most people are going to be able to see it digitally is through it being a Patreon exclusive. Okay. Other than that, if this isn't a Patreon exclusive, then what Dave is saying is absolutely right. you don't want to think about Patreon as being a host necessarily, unless you're talking about an exclusive comic.
Well, even more to that, like, even though you host After Dark as an exclusive, Brad, you still have your Walmart Doorbuster special of Evil Inc. publicly posted. And you guys all know what the Doorbuster is, the sort of the loss leader, where they sell, I don't know, Blu-ray players for $40 at the front door to get you into the Walmart, so that you then spend $50 on groceries, $100 on toiletries, and $200 on clothes. The idea is it gets you in the door and you start spending more money. That's what Evil Inc. is for Brad.
Yes.
The public-facing Evil Inc. gets you in the door, and then for a percentage of his audience, they go, wait, what's this After Dark thing? Yes, I would like to spend 10 or 20 bucks a month to get that, right? And so Brad hosting publicly builds his exclusive audience. If Brad didn't, I would argue that if you didn't have that public-facing loss leader, essentially, then you wouldn't have the much higher earning Patreon exclusive. So that's why I was saying with Shani, I don't want this all to be behind the paywall, because it limits growth. It actually inhibits growth in the long term. So that was my thought. But I take Brad's point as well. So let's move on to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is that you eventually wanted to offer a printed book to higher pledged backers. And that specific phrasing got me a little nervous, Shani, because I
didn't
don't
even
want you
catch that. Yeah, that's a good catch. That's a big no-no.
Yeah. So Shani, I don't want you to do it where the book is part of the promise or the tier reward. Yeah. Because if I'm reading your question right, and that might have just been a throwaway phrase in the sense that you said it incorrectly, but a book is a separate object from the Patreon backer and or the patronage of the Patreon backer. And so I don't want you to say like, hey, and once you've backed me for a year, you'll also get a book. No.
Oh,
those patrons will pay for the book. They will pay for the Kickstarter book. That's the way you draw it once, get paid for it multiple ways. You have the Patreon, and then you have the Kickstarter book or the sold book, right, Brad?
Absolutely. Don't make that mistake. Number one, Patreon rewards should be monthly rewards. Think about it this way. You want a monthly backer, you need to offer a monthly reward. So any reward that you've got to pledge for a year to get, for example, or 6 months to get, is a bad reward, especially if that thing only comes once at the end of that year, right? This is not a good idea. And what Dave said is absolutely true. So many people are like, well, they're my Patreon backers. I've got to give them the book. No, you don't. In fact, what you're going to find out is, number one, that book should be a Kickstarter project.
Right.
You launch that Kickstarter, and then you give your Patreon backers early access to the Kickstarter and put a couple of levels there that are only for them, that you're going to shut off after the first day, right? You launch that Kickstarter. You don't tell anybody about it except your Patreon backers. And you tell them, I've got special tiers just for you that are going to be turned off after 24 hours. You watch those Patreon backers line up to support you on Kickstarter. Right. Not a one of them expects that book as part of their Patreon support. They're going to go over there. They're going to think that you're the greatest person in the world for setting up those special tiers. And your Kickstarter, when you do announce it the next day, is going to be gangbusters, because your Patreon backers, remember, they're your biggest fans. That's why they're Patreon backers. Your Patreon backers are going to already have pushed this thing right up towards the goal, if not past it. You do not make that Kickstarter. You don't confuse Kickstarter and Patreon. They're two different things. Oh, and by the way, as you're doing the Kickstarter, all those people that are discovering you through Kickstarter, tell them about your Patreon, because that goes crossways. It goes back and forth. But no, your Patreon backers do not expect the book. Don't do that. That's a terrible idea. Put it over on Kickstarter and watch your Patreon backers line right up.
Huge cosign on that. So I won't elucidate more on that, but I will say this, Shani. I think to synthesize the best advice that you got in this answer, the majority of the good advice is from Brad on this one. And to synthesize it down into a sentence or two, I think design for the full page, both Brad and I would say that, design for the full page for the eventual book that you want to make. We both agree that that's a great idea. Yep. But to Brad's point, which I think is the better advice, design it with a tiny eye so that it can be either sliced or reduced or created into a vertical format very easily. And I think that with Brad's advice earlier, that's very doable. And I think do share it vertically. I think Brad is probably wiser than I on that. And so I'm willingly and humbly admitting I'm probably doing it the wrong way. Brad's probably doing it the right way.
Remember, nobody has ever read a comic or continued to read a comic or suggested a comic to their friend because of the layout. Nobody's ever read a comic because it had a good layout. Don't get all wrapped up in this layout. And number two, although I know it sounds self-serving, go to evil-comic.com and just page through some of the comics that you're going to see there and realize with all of those floating circular panels, all those characters that reach outside of their panels, all of that stuff, realize that I'm chopping those up into rectangles to be vertical scrolls, all of it. And you'll see that there's a whole lot more versatility than you at first think.
Amen. So, Shawnee, best of luck with that, and thank you for the kind words. That was very nice of you. And Bradley, I'm going to jump us into the next question from patreon.com/ComicLab. This comes in from Tate, and Tate writes, "Greetings from behind the redwood curtain." What's the redwood curtain? I actually don't know what that is. Is that
I don't know. Out in the woods, I guess.
Pacific Northwest, maybe? Is that the redwood curtain?
Yeah, that must be. Well,
let me ask you this side note question, Brad. Have you, as a Michigan boy or now a Philadelphia boy, have you ever been out to the California redwoods, the great sequoias?
I have not. We've talked about it a couple of times, but I've never been out there. Every time I'm in California, I'm at the Kellets. That's what I'm out there for.
That's the place to be.
Yeah.
That's almost as majestic, frankly, as to just see Dave padding around his house as a 3,000-year-old redwood. Yes. No, I got to tell you, if you ever get the chance, Brad, I would love, perhaps when we go do the Peanuts talk, now that the pandemic, I hope, will let us go do the talk at the Peanuts Museum in Santa Rosa. You should fly into LA. We'll drive up and we'll go through the sequoias and the redwoods up there.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Because those 3,000-year-old trees, Brad, you walk 100 yards from the road and you are in like Jurassic Park quiet. It is gorgeous. The oxygen, nothing smells more pure than that forest.
Wow.
And the trees are amazing. And anyway, I don't know why I suddenly became a tourist guy for Northern California, but here we are. All right, anyway, here is the question. Tate writes in, "Greetings from behind the redwood curtain. Dave and Brad, the two of you present yourself not only as professionals, but as authorities on the topic of comics. I think the average creator would be reluctant to call themselves an authority, perhaps yourselves included. I was wondering if you might want to talk about how important you think presenting yourself as an authority has been in your own success, and if you think the average creator should put more thought into presenting themselves as an authority as well as a professional. If you think the two are the same thing, I would argue that not all professionals create instructive materials, how to make webcomics, or make themselves available to answer and discuss questions. I think many others would make a similar distinction as well and consider themselves one or the other, but not both." So, Brad, one of the reasons why I think this is a great question is I mainly want to talk, we can talk about it in regards to ourselves, and we will, but I mainly want to talk about the final point, getting to where the advice that we would give to creators, because I think it's more important to broaden this out to all of us as creators and cartoonists and how we think of ourselves and present ourselves.
Right.
But first, Brad, let's ask the central question that Tate asks, which is, do you think of yourself as an authority, and how much do you think that presenting yourself as an authority on comics has impacted your cartooning career?
Yeah, well, number one, I think, although it's weird to be put in the position of having to say it, I absolutely think of myself as an authority. I've written 3 books on the subject. Webcomics.com is 10 years old. This podcast is in its 4th year of weekly, actually twice a week if you count ProTips. And I've got a career that has an awful lot of work that has been produced out of it, some of which was pretty good. I think I can present myself as an authority pretty believably. It doesn't mean that I'm like the greatest person ever. No, but I do know an awful lot about this stuff. But the more important question is, do I think that presenting yourself as an authority has helped my success as a cartoonist? Well, at which point I've got to ask you, what do you think came first, the chicken or the egg? Because that's the question you're actually asking. In other words, if I hadn't had a certain amount of history and quality, and if I hadn't had some skin in the game as a cartoonist, do you think anybody would take me seriously as an authority? No. In fact, it's the first thing you notice when you see an awful lot of books, probably mine included, depending on who you are. You look, here's somebody who wrote a book, How to Be a Professional Cartoonist. And you look at the name and it's somebody you never heard of, right? Mm-hmm. That happens pretty often. And you go, who is this person? Why are they writing a book? Why would I want to read it? Right. And I'm sure people have picked up my book and said, who the hell is Brad Geiger? You know, what does he have to say about this? So it's a chicken and the egg question. Do I think that my presenting myself as an authority has helped me as a creator? Not necessarily. When it comes down to being a creator, the only thing that counts is today's comic good. That's the only thing that counts. Everything else is second to that.
Yeah.
And as far as would a creator be helped by presenting themselves as an authority? Not unless they've got the stuff to back it up. You can present yourself as an authority all you want. The minute I look at your work and see that it's not good, you're not an authority anymore. You're somebody who's calling themselves an authority. And by the way, I get judged on the same merits. I guarantee you. Like I said, there's somebody that's gone out, looked at the How to Make Webcomics book, looked at my work, said, nah, this guy is coming at comics from a perspective that I don't appreciate, and didn't buy the book. That's how we all live and die. So do I think calling myself an authority has helped my success? No, but my work in comics has absolutely bolstered when I go out and talk about things, because people who have seen my work understand they're hearing it from somebody who's been doing this for 20 years and done some pretty good stuff. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I think there's three different things to address in Tate's question. One is, do I consider myself an authority? The second one is the interplay between being an authority and my being a cartoonist, and do they have any impact on each other? And then I think the third one, the most important one, is to talk about imposter syndrome and the confidence that we need to have as creators, right? And so let's talk about the first one first. So do I consider myself an authority? I mean, more than anything else, I think Brad and I, on the average day, if you poke us, we're pretty humble about all the mistakes we can continue to make on a daily basis, right?
Oh yeah.
I think there's if you also scratch the surface, I think there's this tiny amount of pride in the fact that I like the fact that I have 2 master's degrees in the history of comics. All right. There are some people like Jenny Robb, the head of the Ohio State Cartoon Library. That was the qualifications that made her the head of that library. She has 2 master's degrees in comics. So there's a certain pride there. I made a documentary film that took me 4 years on the history of comics and interviewed 300 hours of the best cartoonists in the world on that film. I wrote a how-to book with Brad and Chris and Scott and myself, and that was delightful. I've done God knows how many hundreds or thousands of hours of talking about and thinking about comics with Brad. You and I, Brad, have had corporations and Comic-Cons pay us, fly us out, put us up to talk about the topic of comics and how it relates to their business or their institution. So I do think that as much as one can on the road of life try to get better at a thing, I think Brad and I are authorities in comic, and I think that's okay to say that. I don't. It's funny because I can hear my humility coming in at the same time that I'm trying to say
it's sneaking in. It's sneaking in. It's harder and harder for you to say it.
That's why I want to eventually talk about imposter syndrome, because I think we all fight that. But anyway. The second one, though, Tate, was like, has it informed or improved my ability as a cartoonist by presenting myself as an authority? Well, I'll tell you what it has done. It's helped me by being present in this podcast every week, where I'm accountable to Brad and to some extent accountable to listeners. I have to keep my head on a swivel of what's working in comics, what are people doing in comics, what are the business approaches, what are the artistic approaches, what are the philosophical approaches. And I think that has 1,000% informed my current cartooning and the steps that I'm going to take in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, right? And then I think in my cartooning, the day-to-day hiccups and successes and failures and positives have impacted in the reverse the way I approach talking about comics on this show, or talk about on the How to Make Webcomics book, or edit the film in Stripped, right? That day-to-day approach of cartooning for 2 decades now has informed how I talk about and how I present the art of comics, the philosophy of comics. So I think there is a nice dance and interplay between the two. And I think it is a rising tide that lifts both boats, right? You know, if you study and focus and think about a thing a lot, you're going to get better at it. And if you work on that thing a lot for tens of hours a week, you're going to get better at how you think about it and philosophize about it. So I do think it has been a net positive about me because I love the art of comics. Brad loves the art of comics. We choose to talk about the art of comics for hours and hours a week with each other because we love, not only do we love each other's company, we love the topic. This gets me excited. I legitimately love comics, right? So I think they, in a way, if you really love comics, you're going to study about it. You're going to read up on the history about it. You're going to, even in a casual pro-am basis, you're going to learn, you're going to become a little amateur historian on comics in the next 10 or 20 years, right? And so anyway, to get us to the final point that I want to say is that you could see, despite the pride and small ego that I have in terms of the work that I put into comics over the years, I still have humility, maybe false humility, about presenting myself as an authority because we're all fighting imposter syndrome. Like, well, everyone else is, surely there's someone better at this than me. I don't know. I'm not very good at this, you know? And so I think Brad in fact, I know this. It's easier for me to promote Brad and Brad's authoritativeness on comics than it is for me to promote my own authoritativeness on comics. Like, I could very easily stand on a soapbox and say, Brad is amazing. But as soon as someone goes, now talk about yourself as being amazing, I go, well, I have a lot of problems and faults and I think everything. You know what I mean, Brad?
Oh, yeah.
So I think the bigger takeaway from Tate's question for all of us is that we've got to fight that. It's okay to say, I've been cartooning for 10 years and by God, I've gotten good at it. Or I've been cartooning for 20 years or 5 years. Or, you know what? I studied such and such for years and years and years and I've gotten great at watercoloring. Whatever it is, we got to fight that imposter syndrome because it has a way of being corrosive on your own outlook.
It's a real killer, and it's a creativity killer too. I mean, not only does it kill you from an ego standpoint, but it drains your creativity if you think that way too. Long ago, I don't know, somebody. I've never talked about this on our PBS channel in Huron County in Michigan. They didn't have Bob Ross. They had another guy, a German guy, and he did the exact same show, but he was a German guy.
Without ever having seen this show, can I reenact what that show was?
Yeah.
And we're going to put the tree over here, and it's going to be a happy tree, and we're going to put the stream through the trees. No, go ahead. What was it?
No, he was a joyful German. The same thing, but like super. He was like a German Bob Ross.
Yeah, hello, we're going to put the tree over here. Oh, like you could hear the beer stein music playing in the background.
Da-da-dum, 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 da-da-dum. So, and what he said, and I swear to God, Dave, I might have been like 9 or 10 years old watching this thing as I'm flipping through. He said this sentence. It has stayed with me every day of my life since. And he says, you know what? When you're an artist, you've got to be a little bit egotistical. You've got to be able to say, that's how I did it. That's how I want to do it. Even if you're learning, you've got to say, I've made that choice and then stick with it.
Yeah.
And he says, it doesn't matter whether the next time you do it, maybe you'd make a different choice. That means you learned, and that's a good thing. But in that moment, you've got to be cocky. You've got to be egotistical to be an artist, because being an artist means making 110 choices every minute. Should I make his nose big? Should I make his nose small? Should I do this with my word balloon? Should I do that? And nobody's ever going to get anywhere with that if they're second guessing themselves. And at some point, you've got to give yourself permission as an artist to be a little bit egotistical.
I'll give you the best example of when it's really hard to fight imposter syndrome. And for me, that's when I, Dave Kellett, am standing behind a table. Standing 3 to 4 feet on the other side of a table is a potential customer or a customer, someone who willingly wants to be a customer, right, Brad? Who has come up to my table to buy a book. And to this day, although it's faded a little bit, let's say it's mainly in the early years of my career, I would be like, here is a book. It's $30 for this book, right? I've priced it out. That is the rate at which the cost of goods sold is priced in. That's where the rate of wastage is priced in. That's where profit is priced in. I have worked out the math. That is where that book needs to be, $30. Here's what happens in my brain, though, at a Comic-Con. I mean, I could go down to 20 if you wanted to. Oh, you only have 15? That's fine. I mean, maybe the book's worth 15. How about 10? 10's fine. 10's fine. That's what, in the early years of my cartooning.
All of a sudden, you're in a bizarro world auction.
Yes,
you're going the wrong way. 30. Do I hear 25?
By the way, they're smiling and getting out the $30. And somewhere in the back of my brain, especially in the early years of Comic-Con, I'd be like, I mean, I would even take 10. 10's fine. If you just only have 10, that's fine.
How about I just give you the book, carry it to your car, and give you a push down towards the parking ramp?
Yeah, like, here, take the book for free, slap me in the face with it, and then I'll go home and keep working and try to get better, right? But I mean, partially, I think that's instructive because a little bit of that, I know that exists on a little bit in every one of us, that even when we have to say, hey, I have a Kickstarter, it's great work, you should check it out, I'm really proud of it. All of us want to go, I mean, it's great work, except for page 65. I don't like the way I did that long shot. Don't judge me on that. But hey, join the Kickstarter. Except don't look at page 32, that close-up headshot. I wish I could redraw it. Yeah, I can see younger cartoonists saying things like that.
Yes.
And I know that is a universal because I used to say things internally to myself about that. You know, like I would be selling someone a book and I'd be like, I hope they don't turn to page 72 as they're buying it because I'm still embarrassed about how that page looks. By the way, 72 looked fine. You know what I mean?
Yep. And they would have never noticed. Well, that's something that I would really suggest, just as we're wrapping this topic up. I'd suggest if you do a comic convention, find a friend like Dave and I did for years and years, and tandem the comic convention with them, right? Like, because if Dave ever did start to say stuff like that when I was standing next to him, he'd probably get kicked under the table by me, right? Or at least afterwards, I'd say, hey, you know what? I heard what you said there, and don't say that about yourself. You know, you're a good person, and accentuate the positive.
Well, you know what? I know I was joking around about Scott Kurtz before in the show, but early on in our careers, you and I and Scott and Chris would exhibit together, and we did a big, like 20-foot long table, and the four of us would move around and laugh with each other all weekend. It was really fun. But I will say this, and I want to give Scott a shout out for this. I remember sitting next to Scott, and this was maybe the first, I don't know, year 8 of my cartooning. So by this point, I should have gained a certain amount of confidence. Yeah. But sitting next to Scott, someone would go, oh, PvP, what's this? And Scott would say, to his incredible credit, oh, it's a comic that I do about such and such. It's really good. You're going to love it. You should check it out. And I remember sitting next to him going, hot damn, where does that come from? How do I get that? That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And I learned that it's true, though. His work was good. My work was good. There's nothing wrong with having the confidence to say, as in, like to Tate's question, to having the confidence of being an authority on your own work and saying, it's really good. You should check this out.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, don't we find that time after time in real life that people are attracted to confident people?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
And that is what's happening there. Is you're in not to make it weird, you're in a flirtation there, right? And you need to be a little bit attractive because nobody wants to go on a date with the guy that says, well, you know, I might be able to, you know, have a conversation with you. No, they want to go out with somebody that is confident, and that confidence breeds kind of success because you're out there saying, no, this is a good thing. You're going to really like this. And I'm really, by the way, it's why I always emphasize pride on social media. I'm really proud of this thing I did. Once you can get yourself to say that and get into the habit of saying it,
that's good.
That's a word people really respond to. Because it's a safe word. It's not saying this is the best thing you've ever seen, because that feels weird, right?
Yeah,
but if you say, oh my gosh, I did this and I'm so proud of it, people respond.
This is literally revelatory to me. I have never thought about using the word proud. I'm proud because I don't want to be boastful. My own upbringing keeps me from being boastful, even though I am trying to cultivate a sense of confidence. And I like that proud is not boasting. Proud is saying, I personally hold this of value and I'm happy with how it turns out. I'm not saying objectively, this is the best comic you're going to read. I'm saying subjectively, this came out great, right? And that's what proud is. I don't know why I'm reacting to the word proud like a small child, but I've never heard this word before.
this has been a good show. We've learned a lot about authority. We've learned a lot about your history with Scott Kurtz. We've learned that you don't follow me on Patreon, and we learned that you didn't follow me on social media because you don't see any of this stuff I'm doing.
Well, can I tell you what I do? I like books. I like reading your work in books. I really do.
Do you really? Because I honestly do think my books read better.
I legitimately say this to people when they buy Drive books. I create Drive to be read as a book. Like it's fun to produce it, periodically and to have it released every week. But I produce it for the book. But I have found, especially as after working on a computer all day, I don't want to read comics on a computer. I want to read comics in a book. And so I wait for, I literally have your book right here on my shelf, and I enjoy reading it. In the print is gorgeous. The quality of the reading experience is gorgeous. The paper is gorgeous, and so for me, that's more fun than reading it online. I don't like that. That one of the reasons why I talked about the Patreon app. I don't like that as a process. I don't like that app. I don't like the way that reading experience works, and that's why. But again, that's mirror marketing. Is that you are right to point out to me that even though I, Dave Kellett, don't give two shits about vertical scroll reading because I don't do it. I need to do it because that's where the majority of the audience is going. So you're right. That's why I said you were right to Shani's question. I was wrong. You were right.
Well, see, now you made me feel terrible. I was going for a snarky joke and you said all this nice things about me. I don't know where we can go from there.
Well, Brad, I want you to have the confidence to not feel an imposter syndrome that I enjoy your books and I think you're one of the best cartoonists I've ever met. That's what I want you to feel.
Now you're making that. I'm literally now getting embarrassed. So you know what I'm going to say to you about your work? I'm going to say, number one, I think you're the best. But I'm also going to say you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my pal, Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my good friend, the better of the two of us, that's the young Mr. Dave Kellett, co-director of Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
And Brad's book collections can, of course, be found over on his website, and I highly recommend that you check them out, as they are my favorite way of reading Brad's work. Also over at evil-comic.com. The Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Windsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode.
And Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com. What?
We got so close. We got so close.
Let's try this slow, David. Don't get nervous. Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/comiclab. See, there we go. So I'll go ahead and I'll say that twice. Patreon.com/ComicLab. Oh, there we go. We did it. I stuck the landing. See, much like Nancy Kerrigan, I stuck that landing.
Yes.
So, Brad, speaking of your banana hammock, now that you are fully vaccinated, could we safely say that you would be vaxxed and waxed and ready for your banana hammock? Would that be the right way to say that?
Yes, that's right. That's replacing tanned, rested, and ready. Now I'm vaxxed, waxed, and ready to go.
Vaxxed, waxed, and ready for a summer in that banana hammock.
Well, listen, you got to wax before you put your banana hammock on, because that otherwise you're going down a very dark road.
Now, let me ask you, I who have seen you in a bathing suit, when do you end the waxing? Like, how far do you go in every direction? Once you start waxing for a banana hammock, you could technically go the full 9 yards. Do you go Olympic swimmer and go smooth like a baby? How far do you take the waxing?
You know those people who just keep getting tattoos because they just like the way it feels and they just get sleeves and sleeves and sleeves? I understand those people.
Oh, God. Oh, that's so disturbing. Oh, I'm going to go take a cold shower.